My name is Kelly, and I'll be taking you through Module 1 of this trauma-informed company training. I'll be talking about common signs of trauma in the workplace and what elements makes the workplace trauma-informed. This module will provide an introduction to trauma, how it relates to human trafficking, and common signs of trauma in the workplace. I'll then provide an overview of a trauma-informed approach to people management and the principles underpinning it. Finally, this module will teach people managers how to respond to potential signs of trauma in the workplace. As a result of this module, you'll be better able to define trauma and describe its impacts on an employee's well-being and performance, name and provide examples of trauma-informed care, and respond to the different signs of trauma in the workplace. In this section, we will introduce what trauma is and how it may impact survivors. Trauma is defined as an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, and emotional or spiritual well-being. Thus, trauma centers around these three E's: the event, the experience, and the effects. First, we have the event. Traumatic events can include near-death experiences, the loss of a loved one, witnessing a violent act, experiencing child abuse, histories of oppression and exposure to gender-based violence and harassment, including domestic violence, sexual harassment, and human trafficking. These events may occur once or multiple times throughout one's life and can have compounding impacts. Next, we have the individual's experience. One's individual experience of these events or circumstances helps to determine whether it is a traumatic event. What is traumatic to one person may not be for another. These events often trigger an unconscious flight, fight, or freeze response in our brain and floods our body with stress hormones. How an individual perceives and processes the event, interprets what happened, and is harmed by an event will contribute to whether or not it is experienced as traumatic. Finally, there are the effects. Those who experience trauma often feel powerless, guilt, and shame. They might feel humiliated, betrayed, or silenced. These feelings, coupled with the stigma against being a victim, can often cause survivors to be reluctant to speak out or to seek help. Without proper support and care, the body's natural response to trauma can be detrimental to one's long-term physical, emotional, and cognitive well-being. Due to the multifaceted nature of human trafficking, survivors often experience trauma that is compounded by past events and experiences. As shared earlier, human traffickers target those with past experiences of psychological trauma. Traffickers exploit these past experiences and exercise tactics of power and control, including physical violence, sexual violence, psychological abuse, isolation, economic abuse, coercion, and threats against them or their loved ones. Experiences of trauma often result in a survivor losing trust in the world around them and in their abilities, and leads to a state of hypervigilance and chronic stress that is exacerbated by fear instilled by the trafficker. The same event may be experienced differently by different people depending on the lived experiences of those individuals, the individual's cultural beliefs, the developmental stage of the individual at the time of trauma, whether trauma occurred while the person was a child or an adult, as well as by the support systems they may have. Even after escaping trafficking, these experiences may be replicated by other systems, even those that are designed to help. The impacts of trauma may be present throughout one's life and may change over time. As you can see here, there's a broad spectrum of responses. They may be moderate or severe and may manifest as behavioral, psychological, physical, or cognitive in nature. There is no typical response to trauma. A person can completely withdraw or they may seek attention. A person may be angry or show signs of depression. Additionally, traumatic stress may impair one's physical health and cognitive functioning. It is important to note that with proper treatment and support, these impacts can be diminished and decline over time. As a people manager, having an understanding of what can drive an individual's behavior can help you to better empathize with colleagues, provide them support when needed, and create an enabling environment where all team members can thrive. Emotional, behavioral, cognitive impacts of trauma often show up in the workplace in a variety of ways. Some survivors may be uncertain and feel insecure and unable to make a decision because of years of psychological abuse. Some may struggle with memory or concentration issues. Others may want to be independent and struggle to work with others because of protectiveness and mistrust. Some may take unexpected or frequent absences stemming from chronic health issues, and others may be very guarded and hypervigilant or seem easily startled. All of these can make it difficult to connect to the workplace community and fully engage in work, which can impact work performance. What is often interpreted as a bad employee may simply be a survivor whose trauma is interfering with their ability to work despite their strong desire to succeed. A trauma-informed workplace can help reduce the impacts of trauma and better support a survivor's success, as well as the success of the entire workplace. In the next section, we will define and provide examples of the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. Trauma is undeniably present in the workplace. For example, a national study conducted in 2013 found that 89.7% of US adults had been exposed to at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. Of this group, a significant share indicated that they had experienced gender-based violence and harassment. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic itself is an example of a collective traumatic event affecting individuals across the globe. With the realization that trauma is present, and the next step is to understand trauma and how it impacts individuals and shapes their behavior and interactions. As described earlier, these impacts can be emotional, psychological, physical, and cognitive, and can have significant impact on an individual's ability to function at their best. How people managers respond is critical. A trauma-informed approach is one that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in staff, responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. Becoming trauma-informed often requires a change in the workplace culture. While it takes time, there are critical and meaningful steps that can be taken to move towards an environment of safety and support. Additionally, when engaging with others and working towards creating a trauma-informed workplace, it is essential to continually check and reflect to ensure that our well-meaning actions don't unintentionally cause harm. A trauma-informed response centers around 6 principles: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, empowerment, voice and choice, collaboration, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. Physical and psychological safety is critical. The workplace must be physically safe, and interpersonal interactions should promote a sense of safety, care, and respect. Operations and decisions should be conducted with transparency and with the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff. Providing support and community helps to break through the isolation many survivors experience. The sense of belonging, connection, being seen, and feeling cared for helps to establish a sense of safety and trust and promotes healing, ultimately empowering survivors. Workplace environments that provide opportunities for all employees to share in collective decision-making, have ownership and autonomy in their individual roles, and routinely seek input helps to empower survivors and co-workers, leading to greater levels of collaboration. Finally, cultural, historical, and gender issues must be recognized and confronted. Trauma-informed workplaces actively move past cultural stereotypes and biases and center equity in policies and practices, offer or provide access to gender and culturally responsive services, and recognize and address historical trauma that has harmed and disadvantaged racial and ethnic minorities, women and gender non-conforming individuals, LGBTQIA individuals, and other marginalized populations. In this section, we will share ways people managers can respond to different signs of trauma in the workplace. A traumatic response is a biological response. It stems from our survival instinct and can affect individuals differently. Responses are the emotional and physical symptoms that may arise immediately, or they may be triggered later on by an event or emotion that rouses a past memory. They may also never be consciously understood at all. It is important to note that trauma responses are normal responses to an abnormal situation. There is no right or wrong to respond to trauma or abuse, and often these responses are experienced automatically as a survival response. Over the next 4 slides, I will describe 4 common responses to trauma: the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses, and how you as a people manager might respond with a trauma-informed approach. First, let's discuss the fight response. When someone is experiencing a fight response to a traumatic incident or trigger, they may show signs of aggression, irritability, and confrontational behavior. Fight responses in the workplace can include insults, passive-aggressive behaviors, paranoia, gossiping, name-calling, and disruptive behaviors like interrupting meetings. When someone is experiencing the fight response, it is important to meet it with compassion and not to escalate the situation by pushing back in some way. Try to identify what is upsetting to the person and reflect this back to them. Acknowledge their feelings and recognize what they are feeling is valid. For example, I'm hearing that you are upset because a coworker corrected a mistake you made during an important meeting. Is that right? Even if their emotions or reactions may seem out of place to other observers, understand that the person may be reacting in part to their past experiences of trauma as well as their current event. For example, if an employee gets angry about being left off of an email chain and writes an inappropriate response, recognize that this anger may stem from feelings of powerlessness or being silenced in the past. While being supportive, you must also set clear boundaries on what is appropriate and what is not, and work to address the trigger and repair any harm done without blaming or shaming. For example, say, "It is absolutely okay to feel upset and frustrated. What is not okay is name-calling in the workplace." Offer support, options, and a way to let the person experiencing fight response feel that they are safe and have control over the next steps in the situation. For example, say, "What would be helpful for you right now? Would you like to take some space to process alone first?" The next response people often think of is a flight response. Flight responses occur when an individual feels a need to flee emotionally or physically from a situation or trigger. Flight responses include walking or running away from a situation, abruptly leaving the room or meeting, procrastination or overworking, deflecting during a conversation through humor or redirection, or using numbing behaviors like substance abuse or even the overuse of social media. Examples of the flight response include an individual showing up at work, leaving work early, or emotionally disconnecting or withdrawing when they typically were more engaged. To respond to someone who is exhibiting these behaviors, check in to name what you have observed and share that you are concerned about the person's well-being. As a people manager, you are there to help them succeed and let them know that you want to work together to find a solution to help. Perhaps there is something about the work environment that is hindering their ability to work, such as having their back to the door or feeling unsafe because they can't observe their surroundings. The person may also have had negative interactions with another colleague and aren't comfortable working with them on a project. Work with the individual to provide options and let them co-determine what is the best solution. The freeze response occurs when a person becomes physically or cognitively immobile when faced with a reminder of a past trauma, particularly when it involves fear and powerlessness. Freeze responses include dissociation or sense that someone is spacing out or not present, inability to move, long periods of silence, excessive intellectualization, having difficulty making decisions, and responding in a way that is not appropriate to the situation. If a coworker displays symptoms of a freeze response, connect to them one-to-one to offer support, naming the specific behavior and expressing concern. Acknowledge that this behavior seems out of character for them and that you want to help support them to feel safe and empowered in the workplace. Finally, the fawn response, or appeasing, occurs when a person accommodates violence or a traumatic incident or environment as a way to minimize the possibility of further harm. Fawn responses include ignoring one's own needs, thoughts, and beliefs for the benefit of others in the organization and feeling uncomfortable or threatened when asked to give an opinion or advocate for themselves. Appearing to go along with harassment or violence to avoid further violence or targeting. Volunteering for extra projects or committees without regard to one's health or work capacity, and befriending or working to become closer to workers or managers who have caused harm. Examples of this can include when someone plays along with someone sexually harassing them, despite their fear and disinterest, to avoid escalating the perpetrator's behavior from harassment to violence. This can also happen when workers continually say yes to a supervisor when they're too afraid to challenge authority, particularly when their economic well-being is on the line. When you suspect someone may be experiencing a fawn response, it is important to help provide safety and a sense of control. Cultivating a strong workplace culture that empowers all employees to use their voice and choice is essential to promote the psychological safety necessary for survivors to speak up when needed. Let's turn our attention to a case study to help bring the impacts of trauma and the trauma response to life. As a group, please take a few minutes to pause the recording, read the case, and discuss the following two questions. What behavioral, physical, and/or emotional signs of personal trauma is Sophia showing? What type of traumatic response might Sophia be experiencing? In this example, Sophia was a strong and well-liked member of the team. However, her behavior begins to change, escalating in her yelling at a colleague who is trying to help. Sophia is demonstrating potential trauma responses, including demonstrations of anger and irritability, avoidance of certain areas or tasks, feelings of sadness, anger and fear, and emotional swings, reduced work performance, protectiveness, possible sleep disturbances. In the face of the change at work she experienced, she has demonstrated two potential trauma responses. First, the fight response, demonstrated by the following phrase: Sophia got defensive and publicly yelled that she didn't need any help. And second, the flight response, Sophia was beginning to close herself off. Later in Module 2, we will return to this case study to explore how people managers can respond in a trauma-informed manner. This concludes Module 1. In this session, we define trauma and emphasize the 3 E's of trauma: the event, the experience, and the effects. Next, we introduced the 4 R's of a trauma-informed workplace. Realize the presence and impact of trauma, recognize the signs, and respond using the 6 principles of trauma-informed practice. Lastly, we discussed the signs of trauma and particularly 4 common trauma responses when triggered: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. In the next module, we will build on this conversation and discuss why trauma-informed workplaces are critical for survivors of human trafficking.